we're doing which one are we doing first? The BFI one or the personal pick?
We're doing The Treasure of the Sierra Madre
Ah,
first.
yes, the classic, the
Yes,
John
we'll go in
Huston
historical
classic.
order too, because I think that would be good.
That's true. Yes, yes.
So our first movie of the week, our pick is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is a 1948 movie directed by John Huston, and it is an adaptation of the B Tavern. Not. It is an adaptation of the novel by B Tavern, whatever name that is, from 1927. Novel's same name. The main character is played by Humphrey Bogart. He's kind of this loner drifter down in Tampico, Mexico, who meets up with another American down there. Bob Curtin is the character, played by Tim Colt. Tim Holt, not Tim Colt. And they have some success and some failure, and then they eventually run into a old time prospector played by Walter Houston, and they decide to all three of them go searching for go searching for gold in the mountains.
The alcohol has finally reared its ugly head in.
Yes, go searching for mountains in the gold. That makes sense too, yes. Doesn't it?
It does. It does. Now, I just want to preface this discussion by sharing a little interesting anecdote. I watched this movie for the first time last year. Jacob had lent me the Blu-ray and said it was essential viewing. So, trusting Jacob, I took it home and I watched it, and it was. But I watched it a year ago, the exact date being June the 10th, 2019. And this week, when we decided to watch it for the podcast, I finally found a day to watch it, and I watched it. And as I went to log it the second time, I realized that I had watched it on June 10th, 2020. So literally one exact year to the day that I saw it for the first time, I watched it again. And now I'm seriously considering the idea of making every June 10th Treasure of the Sierra Madre Day.
A Chandler Chavez personal holiday.
Personal holiday. And the reason why I would make that a personal holiday, this second viewing, it might just go into like my top 15, top 20 of this movie. This movie is incredible.
I think I've seen it this is my third time viewing it. I watched it. Mm-hmm. It was one of the last films I watched in 2017, I think. Because that was the first year I was doing the Excel spreadsheet of logging movies, and I remember that distinctly. That was one of the last movies I logged that year, and then I watched it about a year later, and then again now, and my opinion on the film has stayed pretty consistent throughout those three viewings, which isn't always the case. And for our second film, I have had very different reactions to the second film each time I watch it. But this one has consistently remained one of the great movies that I have the pleasure to rewatch.
Yeah, and it's a movie that Paul Thomas Anderson really liked this movie, specifically during the period of time he was filming There Will Be Blood. And if you look at Daniel Plainview, the character in There Will Be Blood, there's a lot of John Huston in that character, especially the vocal inflections. But Paul Thomas Anderson, in preparing for this movie, had told Daniel Day-Lewis to watch this movie over and over because he stated that every question of life can be answered in this movie. And I had read about that after the first time I watched it. And I'm like, okay, no, I don't know about that. But there is so much in this movie about human nature and the cruel irony of life and just what greed can do to a person in a way that made me retroactively. The whole time I was watching this, I was just thinking, why did I watch Greed? 4 hours 4 hours of something that never came close to what John Huston did in barely over 2. And the thing is, this is not only a movie that is insanely prolific in its examination of human nature, it's also really entertaining. It's consistently entertaining.
It is one of those old classic films that I would probably recommend without hesitation to most people these days.
Yeah. because some people, when they see something like Casablanca or Citizen Kane, they'll think, okay, I get why this is important, but it's kind of boring. Sierra Madre is consistently like engaging.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on Citizen Kane. I think Casablanca still is pretty acceptable to modern audiences.
Yeah.
At least more so than Citizen Kane is. But
Mm-hmm.
this is, as far as I think John Huston's filmography goes, this is his best. I think the only other one that people would talk about really is the Maltese Falcon.
Or the African Queen.
Yeah.
Have
As far as I'm aware, this is the only one that I think really think deserves to be remembered. And, well, the other ones do too, but I think this is his, by far, the best one, in my opinion.
Yes. This is not only interesting as John Huston movie, it's interesting as a movie as a whole.
Yeah. So this film it has quite a prestigious history. This is one of those movies that has been accepted into the National Film Registry in the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, which probably all three, I think you could say. And this is a film that I think is surprisingly influential today.
Oh yeah.
It's very still well rated. It is on the BFI, not the BFI, the AFI, the American Film
it's like
Institute.
38 or something.
It's number 30, and the 10th anniversary, it's number 38.
Okay.
And we may later on, I think there's a decent discussion to be had about not inclusion on the BFI list, but we'll get.
I agree.
We'll get there later.
But because one thing that I find interesting is just the amount of different directors or filmmakers in general that cite this as one of their favorite movies. Paul Thomas Anderson did it. Kubrick said it's one of his favorites. Sam Raimi said it was one of his favorites. Robert Redford said it was one of his favorites, and I think I can see why, because I can see so much of where movies have gone in this movie, as simple as it is. I think there's just so much going on with these characters, but the story is always very simple. But I find it hard to. It's one of those movies that is so well cast. I find it hard to declare who's my favorite, but this one always stands out to me as Humphrey Bogart, because Humphrey Bogart is, I think, inherently a pretty creepy guy.
This really plays on that in a way that none of his other movies does.
Well, no. Have you seen In a Lonely Place?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I suppose that one too.
These are the only two that I think really play into just how creepy he is. Not just his like sort of dead eyes, but his voice as well. And he goes through a transformation in this movie that is subtle from scene to scene, but when you look at the beginning and the end, completely different people.
It's interesting about that I think there has been some commentary on whether or not you can see his transformation in the beginning of his character. And I want to remain spoiler free for the time being. So maybe putting a pin in that full character, because there's some specifics I'd like to discuss about that. But I would disagree, not in a way that I think you're wrong, but in a personal opinion kind of way, is that Walter Huston is always by far the most enjoyable part of this film.
He did get an Oscar for this.
Walter Huston.
He is great.
I think Bogart's performance is great. Like, I have no fault there. It's more of a personal preference kind of thing, because Walter Huston is just he's just having fun. Like, this is one of the early examples of John Huston, the son of Walter Huston, just casts his dad, and then his dad just fills the role in such a wonderful way that he can just it almost seems like Walter Huston is just existing on set. And that's obviously not the case. He's obviously putting on a performance, but it feels so natural. It feels like this old man just wandered on set and was just having a good old time with Humphrey Bogart digging for gold.
Walter Huston's performance in this is, I think, the epicenter of every single portrayal of a pioneer ever. The happy, crazy, jigging pioneer. Everything from Toy Story 2 to Atlantis, the Disney movie. I don't know why I just went to Disney movies, but
I see it.
in Walter Houston here.
He also kind of fulfills this character archetype of the mentor, which
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
you have people like Gandalf, like the fantasy mentor is how that trope is usually played
Mhm.
out. But in this film, he very much is a early example of that kind of character, of someone who leads the protagonist and teaches them.
Mhm. He's comedic relief that also sort of works as the center of the movie. I think obviously Humphrey Bogart is the center of it, but
Mhm.
comedic relief that also becomes integral to the story, where it doesn't feel like we cut to this character just for a break from the madness, like something like Timon and Pumbaa, where yes, they're comedic and they're entertaining, but they're also very present in the story. Walter Houston is so good in this movie that there is a moment where he does a Looney Tunes-esque fourth wall break that anyone else I would be cringing and I would hate it, but when Walter Houston does it, I'm like, all right, sure.
Well, the thing is he's the smartest person in the movie, and he's also the
He
comic relief,
is.
which often doesn't go together. Often the comic relief is the dumbest person in the group.
Mm-hmm.
So
He's the
that's
most
just refreshing
capable.
to see. You know,
Yeah.
even for an older film, it's still refreshing.
Mm-hmm.
Just because so many modern films play too much into the oh, you have to be dumb in order to be funny.
Exactly. And he's eccentric,
Yes.
definitely. He's not completely up there, but he still knows what he's doing. He's very experienced in this one little area of expertise. But but even the guy who plays Curtin, um, who
Tim Holt.
Hold on, what was his name? Tim Holt. Yes, Tim Holt, who plays Bob Curtin, who Orson Welles famously said was one of his favorite actors of all time. His father, Tim Holt's father, was a silent movie cowboy, so he's kind of he kind of grew up in this sort of environment, and I think Tim Holt's pretty great too. But I do agree that Walter Houston is the most entertaining character and probably the best performance. But whenever I think of this movie, I always think about the Bogart transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously his character is the one that gets the most screen time and analysis. Yeah, there's one common complaint I hear about this movie, arguably the only complaint, is that they don't feel that there is a sense of progression of Humphrey Bogart's character. They feel that he starts off as a greedy asshole and ends the movie as a greedy asshole, which I don't agree with. But I don't know if we wanted to save this for the spoiler section of the.
The great thing about the film is that it's a film that is built upon this trio of main actors that all give great performances, and in particular because of the fact that the script is so well written. I have said before, I think to Chandler, that this is, I think, one of the great scripts.
It is
of all time.
It really is,
and it's interesting because I think this is a film that is, from a structural point of view, very different from your average classic Hollywood Western. It might be a 5-act movie. Regardless of that, it's I mean, look at it. The film starts out and the first 20 minutes are in Tampico, and it's almost like a complete separate sequence entirely from the rest of the film.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And this is something that I do. Yes. It's something that I struggled with the first time that I watched it, because when you look at those first 20 minutes of just Dobbs and Curtin sort of struggling in Tampico, it does feel far removed from the rest of the movie being this gold search. But I think everything that happens those first 15 to 20 minutes is very important in setting up these characters and their goals and just the world that they live in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a movie that feels very novel-like in that way. And obviously it was based on a novel.
Yeah.
But more so than Greed, which literally just felt like, you have insane gaps of time and insane growth of characters that doesn't necessarily translate to screen. I think that this movie really translates that thematic stuff that bridges these seemingly different worlds together. And I also
one of the reasons why that
fights.
opening part works so well is that it flows so quickly. Those are quick scenes where you're going from goal to goal to goal, and everything is a quick progression, and things are changing with every single scene. And then the film starts, there's like this hard cut, and now they're on the train going to search for gold. And the film, then we have like a good sense of our characters, and the film starts to take its time a bit more with where it's trying to go with them. And I'm not 100% sure why it works, but it's down to, those opening 20 minutes are about character, because you meet Dobbs first because it's his film,
Yeah.
and then you meet Holt, and then you meet Walter Houston, and it's this slow build up, and then it's almost like this microcosm of the rest of the film, particularly in like the very first scene of where what is his name,
Dobbs,
Dobbs
yeah.
is,
Dobbs.
he bets on the lottery. He's a betting man, and he doesn't get it. He goes and immediately just starts drinking his sorrows away, and just starts berating this kid for like daring to offer him another ticket. And then after a few seconds of deliberation, I guess I'll gamble again on the next one. And it's very indicative of his character, and going from there.
Yeah, it's especially mirrors the idea of prospecting that Walter Houston lays out early. That you'll get $100, then you'll want 200, then 200 to 500 and stuff like that. And Dobbs very clearly says that's not going to be me. I'm going to exactly what I need and leave, even though that's clearly not what he's doing from the beginning.
It's a tragedy almost, this film,
Almost,
where
yeah.
in a way that where it's going. Like, this film is not a film necessarily that surprises you in any way, but it's a slow descent into madness that
Yes.
you don't want it to go there. You don't want to see Dobbs give into his base nature, but and that's one of the things I really like about the center of the film, is that when you really think about it, Dobbs kind of starts sliding down that hill pretty early into that second act.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are events that kind of pull him out of that, and you get to see who he is, and how and why he kind of slides down. What's preventing him from going down that path, and what kind of allows him to do so at the end.
Whenever I watch movies like this, I always, when I'm watching it, I'll think in my head, okay, what's the dumb version of this movie? What is the version of the script that an idiot would be like, oh no, this is what we change? And what I really appreciate about this movie is that of the three characters, it's really only Dobbs that has his ethics compromised. And I like that Curtin and Walter Houston I don't remember their names, but I like that they remain relatively unchanged. Curtin has a moment when Dobbs gets collapsed under the mine where you can sort of see that, but that's right at that moment you can see that, okay, Curtin is going to reject these inner desires and go down the righteous path. And I think framing the main character and having the two supporting characters come out unscathed is what really makes this effective.
I think it's easy on a first viewing to really see Curtin and Walter Hughes' character. What's his name?
I don't remember. He's Walter Houston.
Walter Houston. They seem very good, and it's in comparison to Dobbs, of course. But when on further examination, they're not exactly good people.
No,
because Walter Houston's character, he freely admits, Howard freely admits, when they're having the little campfire talk, that if he was in his younger days and he was gold prospecting, that he might try to kill someone for gold. He's not lying about the character and the nature of gold. And we see Curtin, he debates with himself about saving Dobbs. It's not a gut reaction. He's not immediately going to do the right thing.
Well, not only that, but Curtin also is on Dobbs' side in murdering the guy who follows him to the camp.
Right.
So
and which I think makes the film very interesting, that there are these subtle shades of where they're not necessarily all great people, but they do the right thing in the end, as opposed to Dobbs.
Yeah, because Dobbs's character is sort of what is showing them where they could go if they gave in to these thoughts. But yeah, should we go into spoilers then?
Yeah. So this is honestly full-on recommendation. It's a great film.
Hard recommendation. one of my new favorite movies, a classic of American film in just about every way. Virtually flawless.
It's interesting that this film does a few things that I think are so wonderful for classic American cinema to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the first movies ever to film on location in a country outside of America. It
Yep.
films in Tampico, Mexico, and I cannot stress enough that it makes the film seem so much more real and tangible from a lot
Mm-hmm.
of other Hollywood productions and westerns from that era. And at the same time, though, it uses sets. There are
Yeah,
background
no, it
rear
does.
screen projections in this film. It feels very much like a classic Hollywood film, but also liberating in that sense because
Yes.
they're on location, they're shooting in these wild places, but it's so wonderful in that comparison
I
to films of its
yes,
time.
I will say this, I struggle to even call this a Western.
Yes.
And I know that it has a lot of the iconography of a Western. I know it has a lot of the themes of the Western, but this doesn't feel like a Western to me. Similarly to something like There Will Be Blood, which you could on the outside call it a Western because it takes place in the American West in this time period and it has a lot of the the same costuming and stuff, but it's about something so much more universal that's not necessarily tied to this time period. Yeah, going back to 2007 film, I just want to say one thing, just jump straight ahead to a spoiler. I think that the way that they kill off Dobbs, it reminded me so much of the way that Llewellyn Moss dies in No Country for Old Men.
Yeah.
Where it's not
Yeah.
it's not super flashy. It's not treated as this big turning point. He is killed and they move on. They he is slashed with a machete. You don't see him go down. You don't see his face as the blood pools. He falls off frame, below frame, and the movie just forgets about him.
He's given the death that he deserves.
Exactly.
He is not a good person and we don't deserve to watch him get cut down.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what's interesting is that death was originally planned to be
Much
bloodier.
gorier.
Yeah, that
Yes.
he was originally supposed to be decapitated on film. And I
Mhm.
love that too. And I think it was Humphrey Bogart said, "What's wrong with being decapitated on film?" Which is great, but also I think the way that it ultimately works out is just as effective as anything.
See, what I find so fascinating about this movie is that John Huston is a very masculine director. He's very much a jock type who started directing movies, and you can see that with a lot of the camaraderie that him and Bogart felt. John Huston was a prankster, notorious for the way he pranked on the actors on set, which we'll get into in a second. But you're also he has this hyper masculine sense of like violence, and his characters, he wants them to be rough and real and shady, amoral, but he's also working under the constraints of the studio system, the Hays Code. And I find it so fascinating the way that I feel like he would be Tarantino-esque or Peckinpah-esque if he was given free reign and he wasn't working under these restrictions. But the way that he works under these restrictions just feels so like ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. Mainly, that death scene in particular is something that I feel is super reflective of that contrasting idea.
Yeah. Another great directorial choice. And we're talking about a lot of things that make me excited for our discussion on The Wild Bunch, because as I'm sure you are aware, we already have touched on quite a few parallels between those two films.
Yes.
And
yes.
One of the other things I love so much about this movie, it's such a small thing, but I wish more movies would do it. There are stretches of dialogue in Spanish with no subtitles. And I applaud the movie so much for doing that. I love it. And the great thing about it is you don't need the subtitles to understand anything about the scene.
Especially that end scene where the bandits take Dobbs's gear and try to sell it in the city.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, when I saw it the first time, I thought, oh, did they fuck up? Is there supposed to be subtitles here? But you literally, from the way that these characters move and the way that they sort of start breaking under the pressure and the way that the crowd sort of moves in on them, you know exactly what's happening and you don't need the subtitles.
Well, because
And
it's
I
also set
agree.
up before. It's a great example of setup and payoff where in the earlier in the film, it spends the time to show you of them making them buying the burrows and making there's the marks and they write it
The
down.
brands. Yeah.
And it's so focused on that
Yeah.
it allows for that moment later when you don't need to hear any of the dialogue and it can just play out visually.
Yeah. And now that we're in spoiler discussion, I do want to point out a few absolutely brilliant parts of the script where
Hmm.
there's so much setup and payoff that isn't exactly clear. It's not super over the top. It's not super present, but something like Walter Houston telling Dobbs earlier in the movie that these bandits, they don't care, they'll kill you for your shoes, or they say at a certain point water becomes the greatest commodity in over gold. And then you have the point where Dobbs has abandoned or tried to kill Curtin, and he's walking, and he's finally drawn to a watering hole where he meets these bandits who find him there, and when they kill him, they don't even realize he has gold, and they literally just take his shoes. That becomes a huge part, and that
Hmm.
also tips off the people in the town that these guys probably stole it, because you get that shot where one of the Mexicans looks down and his feet are framed by like the donkey, where you can see he has one really nice shoe on. And it was something that I don't think I realized this until the second time, that there's just so much. It's a perfect circle.
And you see in that last part with the one shoe, the guy, the inspector looks down at that one shoe, and he's like, well, this person has killed someone because he has one really nice shoe that that person probably
Yes.
shouldn't have.
And that's also because this is happening as a Spanish conversation is going on, and everything from just the look he gives and the way that it's framed, and that whole sequence. I was just like, ugh, amazing,
Yeah.
amazing.
It's a film of contrasts in a way, of like a lot of the characterizations. We kind of touched on this earlier between
Yeah.
Dobbs and the other two. Um, but like the character development and the morals of the film, because the film has a lot of things to say about morals and how one should live your life, what kind of goals someone should have. And, there's a great scene where they're by the campfire, all three of them, and they're sharing what they're going to do when they have the gold. And there's such this vivid contrast between all three of
Mm-hmm.
where Howard's this old man and he's just like, oh, I just need a little gold. And then that like changes as the movie goes on when he gets kind of sidetracked by this group of natives and finds a way of living beyond this gold, that he doesn't need
Mm-hmm.
it ultimately. And then you have Curtin, whose goal is probably the most, I think the film treats as the most admirable of all of them. Of essentially, the film is saying follow your dream in a way, in a very roundabout way. Of he just wants to farm citrus trees. He really loves it. He connected with it when he was younger, and that's what
Mm-hmm.
he should do. And it's just the film is almost sentimental when it deals with those moments, and it's
Yeah.
the film's so dark, but that is like it's like a ray of sunshine in the film, and that's one of the reasons why Tim Holt's character is so interesting, is that he does have that contrast between the other two, of where Howard doesn't really have much to do in his life other than this, and then Dobbs is just about these very superficial things of go to a Turkish spa, sweat it out, get
Yeah.
a haircut, get some food, and then they're like, well, what are you gonna do after that? And it's like, what else is there to do? He's a very simple man, Dobbs.
Yeah. Yeah, because Curtin is very much emblematic of this American idea of, oh, I'm going to go through a rough period. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to get this gold, and then I'm going to turn into something greater. I mean, a farm, starting a farm with the money you got mining, is the most like American thing I've ever heard.
It
And
is.
then yeah, it's very three very clearly different people with very clearly different aspirations in mind, and I another huge parallel to the Wild Bunch, which we'll get into later, is the ending. Because again, I'm thinking about Dumb Movie, at the end when Curtin and Houston, I'm just gonna call him Houston.
That's
Curtin
funny.
and Houston find out that the gold's gone. It's ironically returned back to where it came from. It is dust. It has returned to dust.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a moment
Mm-hmm.
where Houston laughs, and in my mind, every time I see it, I'm like, okay, dumb movie would have him go crazy. This is the point where dumb movie would make Houston go crazy.
And then
But
there's like
I
a
love
showdown
that.
at the end between all three of them or
Yes,
something.
yes. Touching real quick sidetrack, dumb movie also would have all three of these characters turn on each other and get greedy, but smart movie just has the one and two likable characters. But again, dumb movie would be these guys go crazy, they go depressed crazy, but this movie, it starts off as like darkly funny, and then when Curtin joins, it's just funny. I love the laugh at the end of this movie, and it's such a great way to end it.
It's one of my favorite movie endings because it's so idealistic and it's making such a clear point, but at the same time, the movie has earned it in a way that it doesn't feel
Yes.
like it's hitting you over the head with what it's trying to say. It's not being preachy with its message.
Yep. And I do want to point on one thing at the ending. The very final shot, which the first time I thought it was strange, and this time I thought it was brilliant. It's Curtin riding away. Also, we'll get to this in the Wild Bunch, but so many fucking movies in this era, Western movies, just end with people riding their horses away. But it's
My
done
Darling
really well,
Clementine, I thought of that final
Yes.
shot from that film. But
which Tim Colton is also in. But that was at the moment where I'm like, oh, is this really how it ends? Just riding off in the sunset. But then the camera pans down to the gold sack, the sack of Dobbs's gold stuck on a cactus. And I thought that was strange the first time I saw it. But the second time I saw it, now here's my theory. This is
okay.
what I thought the second time.
I have something very specific to say about this too, so I'm curious if we have the
Okay.
same idea.
I know this movie has nothing to do with the idea of reincarnation, but when I saw this, I thought, is this cactus emblematic of Dobbs, even in the afterlife? A cactus putting his prickly arms around the gold so nobody can touch it.
That is a wonderful thought. Not the thought I had, but that was wonderful.
I literally have two notes for this movie that I wrote down, and one of them is just says, "Is Dobbs a cactus?"
In a way, he's a very prickly man.
He is.
But no, so the reason why I love that ending shot, and I didn't love it immediately because it's not ending on the most visually beautiful thing, right?
No, it's
like
very
the
simple
shot
and-
starts with the most visually beautiful thing with
Yeah.
Howard riding off and Curtin riding off, and then it pans down to dirt, essentially, with a broken bag.
I mean, it's not.
The modern day
It's not-
equivalent is if you pan down in a parking lot to a grocery bag stuck on like a piece of gum.
Yeah.
Like that's the modern day equivalent of that.
It's not the most beautifully staged shot.
No, but here's the thing. I noticed this a lot in the way that John Huston likes to frame and begin his scenes, in that often he starts close up in a scene, and where you are on a close-up shot, you have detail, and then the camera moves out to give you the context of the scene. And the great thing, the very first shot in the film, is a close-up on the lottery board. You don't know where you are, you just see the words on the lottery board, and then it pulls out to Dobbs there, and you have the context of the shot. He's checking his numbers. And then the end of the film is, of course, them riding away. It's the wide shot, and then it goes in close to the money being gone. So it's two kind of parallel shots that are both about like people losing money. It's very much emblematic of the philosophy of the film of starting from nothing and ending with nothing, except the nothing is so much more in the end.
Great movie.
Yeah.
Also, this is one of those cases where it's one of the most horribly misquoted famous lines in all of film.
And a reference in Blazing Saddles, if anyone's seen that film, to this.
Yes. Obviously, the line being, "We don't need no stinking badges," is not, I mean, it's close, but it's not exactly it.
Badges? We ain't got no stinking badges. We don't need no stinking badges. Or we don't need no
Yeah,
badges. Something like that. It's
also
easy to misquote because it has a lot of
it
repetition,
is.
but then it doesn't have a lot of repetition.
Yes. I will say I love that actor. He's so great in this.
The it's it's one of those great examples of a movie that feels big but is actually very
Mhm.
self-contained, that has a lot of
Yes.
repeating characters. The world seems big, but everything is recontextualized, and you see things multiple times in the film.
Hmm.
You don't really have all that many locations when all is said and done.
Town Train Hill, Mexican City.
Yeah, essentially.
That's yeah.
The one scene I think that is this is again yet another thing that has echoes in The Wild Bunch, but the one scene that I think is so probably the most beautiful and kind of evocative of a mood, because this film
Hmm.
is it's an adventure, so it doesn't spend all that much time creating atmosphere, if that makes sense. Like, not like a lot of films, not like something like The Lighthouse just begins with atmosphere and it's just atmosphere all the way through. This is just more about the plot and what is happening with these characters.
Yeah.
But there is one moment of, I think, really great atmosphere, and that's when Howard goes to save the little boy in the village, which
Hmm.
I think is another great little philosophical scene about how this film is ultimately
Championing.
championing human life over everything else.
Yeah.
And Howard goes to save this little kid, and it's this great atmospheric scene of him giving CPR essentially to this kid while all of these villagers are looking down, and there's these great shots where they just cover the background, and there's this kind of
Hmm.
low humming score to it that's halfway
Yeah.
between music and humming, and it's almost very spiritual in a sense. It's interesting that those natives, they only really come into play in the last third of the film, although they're a really important part of the film. And it's another reason why I think that the film adheres to something similar to like a 3-act structure.
Jacob from the future here. Just want to let you know that I meant to say 5-act structure, not 3-act structure.
The beginning 20 minutes in Tampico, then you
Yeah.
have prospecting, and at some point they accomplish their goal quite early into the film. Before the halfway mark, they get the
Yeah. It's like
gold.
yeah. Hmm.
And then you have this kind of central action sequence of the film where it suddenly is no longer about the gold. It's about how do you keep the gold once you have it. First, they have this kind of interloper American guy who tries to butt in on their threesome. And then you have the bandits come in, and there's this whole central action sequence. And then the next kind of half an hour of the film is the falling out of that and leaving the mine. And then the last ending of the film is Dobbs is by himself, and everyone, like the very last kind of falling out, and the thematic ending.
Yeah. See, I struggle to even call this an adventure movie. I mean, I guess it is as far as what happens.
It's hard
But
to
you keep saying
classify.
like yes, you keep saying like action, and really, there's not a whole lot of action in the sense, people fighting or big specifically action devoted scenes, but
There's
there
only
is a lot
2
of
gunfire scenes,
tension.
really.
Yes, and the fight, the, the fight in the bar, which fun fact took 5 days to film.
Oh my goodness, that's one of the great things
Right?
with like character development of like Howard and Curtin aren't exactly the not Howard and Curtin, Dobbs and Curtin aren't
They're not
exactly.
action heroes.
Yeah, no, they're not good
They
at what they
barely
do.
win 2v1
Yeah, they
against this
barely get
guy.
to be able to beat him up. It takes them, both of them, and even then, and that's further expanded on of where when they first start going gold hunting, Howard is just like this little
Mm-hmm.
billy goat who's just running up ahead of them,
Mm-hmm.
and
It's
it's
one of my
kind of
favorite
this.
moments.
At first you think Howard's this old man, and like how is he going to keep up with them, and then it turns out like how are they going to keep up with Howard, which is great
Yeah.
little reversal.
And I said earlier that this movie's virtually flawless, and after I said that, I thought, what is the flaw? And if there's one thing that I don't like about this movie, that fight scene, It sounds like they're slapping pudding every time they punch. And I understand what they were doing. They were going for a very realistic, this is not a glamorous fight. It's just a drunken brawl. You can tell that by the lack of grace they have when they're fighting, the fact that people are just watching and not intervening or cheering, but the sounds when they actually land the blows, it's like,
Yeah.
and that's my only problem with the movie. But it's a great scene otherwise.
I think the last thing I want to do is what other influences we might have seen, because I think we talked about There Will Be Blood. Also, Breaking Bad perhaps has some some interesting parallels here and some influence. Jean-Pierre Melville's filmography, specifically his movies like Les Samurai or The Red Circle, where they are films that are with these morally dubious characters that follow them, and then ultimately they get their comeuppance in the end. And I think this is one of the first films that really, in not a kind of cliched and overly condescending way, because I think a lot of early Hollywood films, a lot of them are like, oh, the good guys always win. But this one, I think, earns that in a way that a lot of them don't.
Yeah.
And this, you can almost see the influence in many future films of someone who is morally terrible that gets their comeuppance in the end, and how to justify that in the narrative. And I think you can see that in a lot of films. Almost, I think also Good, the Bad, and the Ugly potentially has some
I agree.
echoes there. Maybe even something like The Hidden Fortress.
I've never seen it.
That might be a little bit of a jump. Fargo, maybe. The greed of Fargo and the kind of
the greed and the structure of Fargo, because Fargo is another one of those movies where it's really hard to categorize into a 3-act structure, because characters just sort of come in and out of the narrative. Like I said before, there's a lot of No Country for Old Men in this movie. There Will Be Blood, obviously, obvious parallel.
I think also you could, if you want to make a stretch, you could even maybe say Parasite a little.
How?
Where it's about greed, it's about getting money, and about how in the end there's kind of like this final 10 minutes where it's about the consequences of your greed and what really matters in this world. And what really matters isn't necessarily the money, it's about the family, and ultimately they don't get that in the end in something like Parasite. And that's more, I don't think that there was any conscious influence there. I just think that you might be able to trace the ideas.
That's the thing. There are some scenes that you can obviously feel are almost referenced in other movies. Did you ever see John Carpenter's They Live?
Yes.
There's a very long fight sequence in John Carpenter's They Live that reminded me a lot of the bar fight here. But it's like,
I see it.
There are very few scenes where I'm like, oh, this was done here. But so much of the essence of this movie, the thematic essence, the way that the gradual decline as instead of the scene to scene stuff, there's so much of every movie in this movie. But typically when you have a movie like that, they usually don't hold up as their own experiences. You sort of see bits and pieces and you find it interesting in that. This holds up on its own, and it's entertaining, and it's influential, and you can see the influence, but you never see it as an influential movie. You see it as the treasure of the Sierra Madre. And that's why I think it's so great.
And I guess my final little thought on this is that the reason why I love it so much is that I really connect with that kind of final message of the film, the dust to dust kind of thing, the impermanence of money. And I guess it might even be like my own personal philosophy of, I very much agree with Howard that sometimes in life it doesn't always go your way and you just have to laugh it off. And that's the best way.
Exactly.
That's the best way of dealing with it. And the first time I don't think I did, the second time maybe not, but this time when Howard started laughing at the end, I was like, I get it. I get the cosmic joke played on them. It's funny.
Yes. My closing thing will be, I just love movies that aren't afraid to show the darker side. Actors who aren't afraid of looking weak or evil or despicable. Everyone in this movie, Walter Houston famously didn't want to play this part because he felt he was still able to pull off lead roles. and he took his dentures out for this role. And Humphrey Bogart was the complete opposite, and he told people ahead of this movie, wait till you see me in this next one, I'm really terrible. And I love that they're all so unafraid to show these horrible sides of humanity in a way that they're still likable by the end, except for Dobbs, of course. It's essential. It's amazing. It's one of the best movies ever made. The fact that it's not on this list is a shame.
Tragedy.
It's a damn shame. It's a tragedy. But I think it's the perfect bridge into the next discussion, which is Sam Peckinpah's 1969?
Yes.
1969 film, The Wild Bunch.
All right, quick break.